Hello, I'm Derek Robbins from Bournemouth University and I'm giving a presentation on luxury and sustainability in tourism accommodation. This was initially started as a student dissertation project and my co-author Justina Gazarak did much of the work involved in this presentation as well. I hope you find it interesting. The project is looking at ecotourism as the fastest growing sector of the industry, alongside luxury tourism. This is tourism associated with the high consumption of resources. And because of such high consumption of resources, there is an assumption that it must be unsustainable, energy intensive. And the question is whether luxury products like ecotourism lodges really can be ecotourism and luxury at the same time. The concept of luxury, of course, is subjective. What's luxury to one person won't be so much luxury to somebody else. So it's a very subjective idea. It's obviously the opposite to necessity, and it serves some sort of form of indulgence and self-pleasure. Many see it as a positive thing because it fulfills our higher needs as human beings, looking at something like the Maslow hierarchy of needs. Others regard it in a more negative light because it's excessive consumption. It might be driven by vanity, consumerism, even selfish motives. So differing views on the concept of what luxury is. Whereupon sustainability really had its sustainable development as an idea sort of emerged from 1987 from the Brundtland Report Commission on economic development. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The definition's been amended and updated since then. And in reality, it's quite difficult to work out what sustainable development is because clearly development uses up resources and clearly there are economic objectives, there are socio-cultural objectives, there are environmental objectives, and there are some who perhaps overemphasise the environmental at the expense of economic development. All three pillars are important in sustainable development. There is, without any doubt, a positive correlation between luxury and consumption. Five-star hotels use more energy than three-star hotels, and three-star hotels use more energy than one-star hotels. They use more water than three-star hotels will use more water than one-star hotels. Five-star hotels will use the highest amount of water, and those with social clubs, swimming pools, will use even more. The CO2 emissions from five-star hotels will tend to be the highest. The rooms will be larger, they'll have fridges in them, they'll have kettles in them, and as you move down the ladder, there will be less facilities available. So there is this sort of link between the star rating of a hotel and its consumption. Just some tables that I'll rush through that identify electricity for different types of hotels, previous studies that look at water consumption for different levels of hotels, and as you can see, in terms of emissions, although accommodation is very important, it's about 20% of tourism's total carbon emissions, it's actually very small in comparison with, say, air transport, which is a much bigger share of the market. With rising environmental concerns, sustainability has become a big issue amongst consumers. And there is this group of consumers, they might be niche consumers, they might be a small group of consumers who actually ideally want a more sustainable product. And so tourism consumption is seen as an expression of self-identity, there's a change in taste, and the industry has responded with new special niche products, and that includes eco-hotels, eco-friendly holidays, green hotels, that sort of thing, as people try to develop their interest in the environment in their holiday-taking activities. One of the problems with sustainable hotels is that they do tend to focus on corporate social responsibility and offsetting initiatives. They will pay money that has been levied on guests into local good causes. They will carbon offset many of their emissions. That doesn't really make them carbon neutral because they're still pumping the carbon into the atmosphere. But it does seem to impress consumers. They seem susceptible to CRS initiatives, and there is a great need for transparency. There is a feeling that consumers can be misled by claims of carbon neutrality, and that can be an issue. What we're going to do for the rest of this talk is look at two small 5-star resorts that are operated by the Soneva Group, Soneva Kiri and Soneva Fushi. These are two small developments, one in Thailand, one in the South Pacific, mainly on island developments, very small, low density, maximum of 65 villas, and very much put in the middle of an island, surrounded by the local indigenous vegetation. So very much an attempt to create a sustainable and green, natural nature type of tourist experience. The company has a philosophy to try and be socially responsible, to try and be green, to try and be eco-friendly. It calls itself Slow Life, which stands for Sustainable Local Organic Wellness Learning Inspiring Fun Experiences, Slow Life, and it claims that there is no significant difference between being luxury and being green and friendly and environmentally sensitive, because it has a completely new idea of luxury. It calls it intelligent luxury, responsible luxury. The most common term they use is barefoot luxury. Because it's in a beach location, because people can walk to the beach, the idea that they can wander around very freely in a pair of shorts, no shoes, is very much considered an important component. It's a sort of getting away from it all type of experience. So with there being no contradiction between luxury and sustainability in the company philosophy, they set out to quite specifically absorb more carbon dioxide than the company releases. And they have a quite detailed sustainability report. There was one written for 2012-2013, and the link for 2013-2014 is shown on this slide, and you can access that and read that at your leisure. The aim of this case study is to explore whether well-managed tourism and hospitality can contribute to sustainable development, whether the philosophy and performance of Soneva actually really does stand up to scrutiny. We will be doing a little bit of a more detailed analysis of their philosophy and their performance. And we will be also looking for some clarification on one or two elements a company representative has spoken to us. And on some levels, the resort performs quite well. So the Soneva Fushi reports an energy consumption of currently 285 megajoules. That's better than the luxury resorts that we were looking at, or the luxury hotels that we were looking at in that earlier slide. The water consumption is achieved by collecting rainwater. They have some wells, and they also operate desalination plants because they're an island location to provide sufficient water. Their emissions, actually, they publish an emission per resident night, but that includes all components of the holiday, including the emissions for importing food to the resort and things like that. The direct emissions are about 25 kilograms per night, per tourist night, in direct energy consumption. 37 if you include the indirect, 25 with direct. Actually above average for a hotel, but well below average for a luxury hotel. And they don't haven't sought accreditation from eco-labels because they argue that the consumers don't recognise eco-labels. There are far too many, between 60 and 100. They've all got different criteria, they've all got different thresholds, and so the resort has not sought to accreditation from outside on its eco-labels. It just publishes what it does. Sabina Fushi has a problem though, in that it uses diesel fuel to produce 85% of its energy. It has a generator available, and there were attempts to replace that generator with alternative sources of energy, wind energy, other more sustainable forms of energy, but it had targets to decarbonise that it has missed both in 2010 and 2012, and there are members that believe that they will find it difficult to meet the targets they've set themselves by 2020 as well. And in fact, the carbon emissions, although below average for a luxury hotel, they're actually rising, not falling. The total emissions are falling because some of the transport bringing imported products is falling, but the direct energy being issued by the resort is actually rising and is 9% above 2008 levels. So that's a movement in the wrong direction. What it does, and this links back to what we were saying earlier about luxury hotels, is it does focus on offset programs and corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility. What it argues, with some justification, is that 83% of the emissions are outside their control, that 71% of the emissions of people staying at their resort are the air travel to get to and from the resort. And they argue, and quite rightly in many respects, that if they're going to be really active in greenhouse gas emissions, they need to take into account those emissions. And they do so by administering a levy on guest bills. So 2% is added to the bill to offset. And the money then that is raised from that offsetting is being spent in 4 separate projects. The biggest one is a very large reforestation project in Thailand, but they are also involved in a number of projects actually giving local tribes and local indigenous population much more efficient cooking stoves, which also reduce emissions. So a number of mitigation projects to reduce emissions elsewhere, but it is offsetting, and it is paid for directly by the consumer rather than being paid for by the resort. Now, it is a holistic approach. Transport is the largest contributor to carbon dioxide emissions, we said so earlier, but we do feel that possibly they could be accused of slightly misleading customers because they're not actually carbon neutral. They're producing quite a lot of carbon and then trying to make up for that with their offsetting program. The other thing that they are very good at is focusing on recycling and waste reduction. 79% of the waste is recycled, and that is all very valuable. But when it comes to it, the majority of the goods that are consumed in the resorts are actually imported, about 75%. They do have organic gardens in both resorts, and these produce about 15 tonnes of fruit and vegetables, which is about 20 to 30% of the total consumed. It's a contribution. They claim it reduces 47 tonnes of carbon a year just by reduced transporting of goods onto the island. But obviously it's small in comparison with the total consumption. The resorts provide training, employment opportunities and employ large numbers of local people. But if you look at the company website, all the management roles, all the higher income roles, even the roles of the chefs are tending to be occupied not by the indigenous population but by labour that has come in from overseas. And this has always been a criticism of multi-chain hotels. It's been a criticism very much of five-star hotels, that actually that they do tend to have a glass ceiling where the indigenous population earn lower levels of income rather than being trained for higher managerial responsibilities. What we also did as part of our study is explore the expectations, perceptions and motives of the consumers. Did they find St Ava a green resort? Did they find St Ava a luxury resort? And what we did was we used an ethnography approach where we found 500 reviews on a range of websites, of which we analysed 292 of them, and these had all been posted by visitors to St Ava resorts. There's a table showing that we, as I say, identified 517 reviews, but actually didn't use all of them because we rejected some reviews. Some were really not very useful. They just said very good and ranked the hotel at 5 or 4 or 3. Others just put in a statement saying very good hotel, and we couldn't really pick up any useful information from those resorts. So those reviews were rejected, and we ended up through this process of selecting from an initial 517 reviews, 292 reviews. And what we identified from the reviews were 6 key themes. The barefoot experience was mentioned by a lot of reviews. It's a phrase that has been developed by St Ava, but clearly the clients adapted to that view. Classic luxury, eco-friendliness, blissful experience were all mentioned as key themes. However, there were about a quarter of the reviews that had some critical comments, and there were some reviews that fell under the heading of not for everybody, or perhaps even disappointment. And we'll look through the views of the consumers. About 90 to 95% of the reviews showed very high levels of customer satisfaction. More than half of the reviews mentioned the barefoot luxury experience. 40% included references to classic luxury. And a quarter of them described the resort as eco-friendly. So in many respects, the marketing and the product seems to be impressing the consumers quite impressively. And we got quotes like those that you can now see on the slides and read for yourselves about it being a relaxing, refreshing experience, and how people have thoroughly enjoyed it. And you can see that consumers agreed that the level of luxury was very high. One of the things that clearly helped the luxury element was very high levels of food. People saying that the quantities were large. Crusoe would have been obese had he been living here, right the way through to Michelin star quality chefs, that sort of thing. The rooms were also spacious, fitted with all amenities. So although you're in a luxury island with a chalet built of natural materials, surrounded by beautiful vegetation, you've still got your iPods, you've still got flat screens, and all the things you would expect to find in a luxury resort. However, more than a quarter of the reviews did include at least one negative comment. One of the problems was the high prices, and with the high prices there were incremental charges, including of course that 2% levy on carbon emissions that I was talking about earlier. And there was a feeling that actually that was not the right approach to set additional charges, but to include that levy in the price from the beginning so that people didn't have incremental charges being added. It's a Ryanair low-cost airline approach was one of the comments we got back. We also found that a minority of guests, and it was a minority of guests, were not impressed with the degree of luxury. We'd previously been to other resorts and they didn't think that what they were paying for, they were getting a 5-star resort experience. Rustic, yes, but it wasn't luxury enough. But this, as I say, was a minority view. risen by some. The negative comments that were really quite interesting was that made us realise that there is a conflict between luxury and sustainability, was the comments made towards wildlife. Luxury is affected by the presence of wildlife. Consumers who thought they wanted an eco-friendly product actually had an expectation of some of the natural inconveniences not being there. And what they didn't like were things like mosquitoes, or an infestation of caterpillars that were very itchy, that caused rashes, to the degree that people were suggesting you actually remove the indigenous vegetation like almond trees and planted something else instead, which isn't exactly being environmentally sensitive to the environment you came from, or the noise that the animals were making, or indeed the local wildlife population, where one guest in particular found a snake in their room. But that's part of the experience. If you're in an indigenous tropical island with snakes, there will be snakes. So there was a bit of a mix of ideologies, charities, marketing gimmicks. There were one or two reviews that really did pick up on the slow life idea, suggesting that perhaps it was being overplayed, oversold, and others that were suggesting that perhaps there was greenwashing going on. One couple was saying that the garden, the eco garden, was very small. As we've identified, it grows about 25 to 30% of just the fruit and vegetable requirements, not the total food requirements. There were other sort of areas where there were sort of dumps, and there were plastic bags and things, and perhaps that actually it wasn't quite all as eco-friendly as it looked. So there were some negative comments that there was greenwashing taking place. So overall, when we looked at the combination of the company philosophy and then we looked at the responses of the customers, they were quite impressed, and it does seem possible to achieve a greater degree of compatibility between luxury sustainability in tourism accommodation. If you make sustainability one of the core elements of the business model, you can make achievements. It's one of the readings in the full paper by Swarbrick talks about making a resort more sustainable rather than just sustainable, and certainly Soneva is more sustainable than many five-star hotels. It uses less energy, it gives off less emissions. It may give off more emissions than an average hotel, but it gives off far less emissions than a luxury hotel, and that's to the benefit. The majority of consumers, however, when left to their own observations, I think displayed a simplistic notion of sustainability, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and that there are conflicts between luxury and sustainability. What I mean about the consumers being left to their own devices is that they are easily impressed by what is easily visible. The original lush vegetation, the fact that the villas look natural, made of natural materials, made of wood, the fact that there was lots of recycling going on. That's an easy thing to show that you're doing. The fact that they were growing their own fruit and vegetables, even if it was only 25 to 30% of the total food. So these are all highly visible policies that the consumers could see. Perhaps what the consumers couldn't see was that actually, at a time when you're claiming to decarbonise, it is difficult to make that claim when your own carbon emissions are going up. And the actual carbon emissions that are going down are in your supply chain, but are not from your own direct experience. And therefore, to try and achieve your objective, and your objective therefore being to push to remove more carbon from the atmosphere than you put into the atmosphere, the only way you can do that is through carbon offsetting, and that's where the focus is. The danger is there's nothing wrong with carbon offsetting. Reforestation projects are good. There's nothing wrong with that at all, but it mustn't take away the focus that your first primary responsibility has got to be to reduce your own emissions as much as you possibly can. And so there was a bit of an issue. Okay, it is certainly true that you cannot grow all the food that you require inside your small luxury resort. However, what you can do if you're importing 75% of your goods is you can have very active policies about local sourcing of product and supplies, reducing the food miles, reducing the carbon emissions, putting more and more money back into the local indigenous community, the local indigenous agricultural community, rather than importing long distance from overseas. So very highly visible that you grow things, but how visible was your sourcing policy? And also in terms of staff, training more and more staff so that the glass ceiling is raised and that they get to an important higher managerial positions. These are conflicts that all need to be addressed. As I say, there is plenty of reading that we've attached to this lesson, and I do hope you found it an interesting look at luxury and sustainability.